The dust of Zion tastes like memory. For years, Elias Thorne had felt it coating his tongue, a fine grit of sandstone and sorrow. Every August, on the anniversary of his sister's disappearance, he returned to the small house in Springdale, the house where her hiking boots still sat by the door, confident she'd be back to fill them. The official story was a clean, tragic narrative, polished smooth by time and repetition. Laura Thorne, 24, and her boyfriend, Liam Hemlock, 26, had set off on August 14th to explore the subway, a semi-technical slot canyon carved by the left fork of North Creek. They were experienced, but Zion is indifferent to experience. A freak summer monsoon, a flash flood, a rockfall. They were reported missing 2 days later. For years, they were ghosts, their faces smiling from faded posters tacked to community boards between ads for river guides and crystal shops. Then, last autumn, a pair of canyoners venturing off the permitted route had found them. The report from the Washington County Sheriff's Office was brief and clinical. Skeletal remains huddled together behind a significant rockfall in a narrow section of the canyon. The cause of death was listed as exposure and dehydration. A slow, grim fading in the dark. The case was closed. The ghosts were given graves. For most, it was a sad final chapter. For Elias, it was a wound that refused to scar over. Closure was a fiction sold to the grieving. The truth was a jagged hole, and knowing how they died only changed its shape, not its depth. Elias Thorne carried the silence of Zion like a second skin. In Springdale, where the red cliffs caught fire at sunset and tourists came in waves that never ceased, he had become something of a ghost himself. Neighbors nodded politely, careful not to mention the obvious, and he in turn carried himself with a kind of quiet defiance, as though he alone bore witness to truths others were too afraid to confront. The official story of his sister, Laura, and her boyfriend, Liam, had been repeated so many times that it hardened into something resembling fact. But Elias could not swallow it whole. The neatness of it, the summer monsoon, the flash flood, the rockfall was too clean for the jagged wound it left inside him. What he remembered most from that August wasn't the rain or the storm reports. It was the way Laura's boots had stayed by the door, toes pointed outward, laces still tangled from her last use, waiting for feet that would never return. For him, every August became a ritual of absence. He would unlock the house, dust clinging to the sill, and stand in the doorway, with a strange hope that perhaps this time the boots would be gone, filled by their rightful owner, who would come laughing through the threshold. But they never moved. They stood as silent monuments, as stubborn as grief itself. When the canyoners stumbled upon the remains for years later, it was supposed to mark the end. The sheriff's office issued a statement no longer than a single page, stamped with bureaucratic brevity. Skeletal remains. Location: behind significant rockfall in the subway. Condition: consistent with exposure and dehydration. Identification confirmed through dental records and fragments of clothing. Case closed. For the town, for tourists who vaguely remembered the posters, for officials who had long since filed the disappearance away in their archives, it was closure. For Elias, it was not. The word itself, closure, sounded artificial, like a door slammed shut in a room still full of unanswered questions. If Laura had died from exposure, why had she and Liam not turned back sooner? Why had they been found huddled together behind a rockfall rather than attempting escape? And why did the report omit certain details that had surfaced in whispers, like the marks on the sandstone near their remains, or the inexplicable arrangement of their backpacks, zipped and stacked neatly as though waiting for retrieval? Elias read the report again and again until the words blurred into meaninglessness, and each reading only deepened his conviction that the story being told was incomplete. Springdale carried on as small towns do, folding tragedy into its tourist economy. Cafes buzzed with hikers fresh off the Angel's Landing Trail. Outfitters sold ropes and helmets to the next generation of adventurers. Brochures in the visitor center still displayed glossy photos of the subway, the sinuous curve of canyon walls like a cathedral sculpted by water and time. Nowhere did they mention that it was also a tomb. Elias avoided the canyon entirely, though it haunted him in dreams. In sleep, he walked the narrow corridors where light barely touched, the smell of wet stone heavy in his lungs. he would see shadows ahead of him to figures, laughing, whispering, and, when he called out their names, the flood would come, black water rushing down with the sound of a freight train. He would wake in the early hours drenched in sweat, the dust of Zion still coating his tongue, and lie awake until dawn thinking of all the ways the story didn't fit. His friends told him he was spiraling. His mother begged him to accept that the truth was simple and cruel. But Elias had grown accustomed to carrying sorrow as weight, and weight demanded to be justified. In the autumn following the discovery, Elias began to retrace Laura's steps, obsessively piecing together the fragments that had been offered as fact. He obtained weather reports for that August week, scanning through meteorological data that showed no rainfall recorded at the time of their disappearance. He dug into ranger logs, speaking with those who had patrolled the area, asking about flash floods and rockfalls, and too often receiving vague answers or polite deflections. Some rangers remembered nothing unusual that week. Others recalled tourists complaining of heat rather than rain. He interviewed shopkeepers who had seen Laura and Liam the day before they set out, both of them smiling, buying extra water bottles and sunscreen, discussing trail permits with the confidence of seasoned hikers. None of these details aligned with a sudden fatal storm. The more Elias pressed, the more he felt the narrative shifting beneath him, as if Zion itself resisted the idea of being pinned down to a single explanation. The canyons were indifferent to truth. They swallowed and silenced, letting the living argue over what remained. At night, Elias reread Laura's journals, faded notebooks she had filled with careful sketches of canyon walls, pressed wildflowers, and descriptions that oscillated between poetic and precise. In one entry, dated just a week before her disappearance, she had written, "The canyon doesn't want us to leave. It wants to keep us in its cool veins forever." He turned the words over like a riddle. Was it foreshadowing, or merely the romantic imagination of a young woman deeply in love with landscapes that dwarfed human fragility? He remembered her voice as she had written those lines, soft yet alive with conviction. Laura had always believed that nature was more than backdrop. It was a presence, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, but never passive. If she and Liam had vanished there, Elias believed, then it was not simply bad luck. It was something else, something in the canyon itself, in the way water carved stone and stone trapped secrets. The sheriff's office discouraged further questions. When Elias requested access to photographs from the recovery site, he was told they were sealed for family privacy. When he asked for the coroner's detailed notes, he was told the case had been finalized. Every attempt to reopen the file was met with bureaucratic walls. There is nothing more to learn, one official told him bluntly. But Elias refused to accept it. He began spending long hours in the county archives, digging through records of other disappearances in Zion, tracing names that had slipped from public memory. A pattern began to emerge. Hikers reported missing near the subway, bodies discovered months or years later, often in conditions inconsistent with official explanations. A climber found wedged between boulders where no storm had been reported. A lone backpacker whose gear was stacked neatly on a ledge, body discovered half a mile downstream. None of it was proof, but together it was enough to convince Elias that Laura's story was part of something larger, something buried in the sandstone folds of the park itself. Elias did not realize when his search for answers turned into a private war. At first, he had told himself he was only honoring Laura's memory, refusing to let her be reduced to a footnote in the park's history. But soon, every corner of his life bent toward the canyon. He stopped taking jobs that required travel, quit his steady work at the mechanic's garage, and spent most of his hours either poring over documents or pacing the edges of Zion as though it were an adversary he could wear down. His friends grew distant, not out of cruelty, but because grief made conversation brittle. His mother avoided eye contact when he visited, afraid of the zeal in his eyes. Even his reflection in the mirror became a stranger, leaner, eyes hollow, beard unkempt, like a man slowly dissolving into his obsession. And still, the canyon did not give. It loomed each day as impenetrable as the last, a cathedral of silence that mocked his desperation. What Elias discovered in his digging unsettled him further. Old rangers, long retired, spoke in careful tones about how the subway carried a reputation no one put in guidebooks. They described it as a place that seemed to change moods, where echoes traveled strangely, and time itself felt unreliable. One ranger told him of a rescue in the late 1980s, when a pair of hikers had sworn they heard voices calling them deeper into the canyon. Voices that turned out to be echoes of their own shouts, distorted and delayed until they no longer recognized themselves. Another remembered how gear sometimes disappeared. Carabiners left clipped to bolts gone the next day. Backpacks left on ledges inexplicably shifted or stacked. No official reports mentioned these stories, but Elias collected them all, writing them in a notebook he carried everywhere, as if compiling his own private archive of Zion's unsanctioned truths. The deeper Elias searched, the more the canyon began to infiltrate his waking life. Nights brought dreams of water rushing in black waves, of Laura's voice whispering his name from behind walls of stone. Days were no better. He would sit at the edge of his bed, convinced that someone had just walked past the window, only to find the yard empty. Once, returning from a hike, he discovered his sister's boots, those same boots, by the door shifted slightly, laces neatly tied as if someone had handled them. He stood for nearly an hour staring at them, unwilling to touch, afraid of the confirmation his hands might bring. When he finally forced himself forward, the boots felt as they always had, heavy, worn, and utterly ordinary. Yet he could not shake the conviction that the canyon had reached into his house, leaving behind a reminder that he was never far from its grasp. Locals began to avoid him outright. At the market, whispers followed his back. Tourists sometimes approached him, curious about the man who had become something of a myth himself, the brother who would not let go. Some asked him to tell Laura's story, as though tragedy were a campfire tale. Elias obliged only once, and the look on their faces, half pity, half intrigue, was enough to stop him from ever repeating it. He did not want to become part of the entertainment cycle, his grief consumed by strangers with cameras and hiking boots who would leave the next morning. For Elias, the canyon was not a story. It was a wound that breathed. In the spring of the following year, Elias made a decision that would alter everything. He obtained a restricted permit for the subway, telling officials he planned to hike with a small group. Instead, he entered alone, carrying nothing but rope, a headlamp, water, and his notebook. He had no intention of treating the journey as recreation. For him, it was communion, a pilgrimage into the heart of the place that had swallowed his sister. The trail began innocuously sand, juniper, cottonwood swaying in the breeze, but the descent into the canyon tightened like a throat, walls rising higher until sunlight was little more than a ribbon above. Water pooled in basins carved smooth as mirrors. The air grew damp, the silence heavy. Every step echoed, carrying backward and forward until Elias no longer knew whether he was moving towards something or away from it. He paused often, studying the canyon as if it might reveal its secrets in patterns of stone. He traced grooves where floods had carved paths over centuries, imagining torrents that could strip life in seconds. Yet something in him resisted the explanation of simple geology. The canyon felt deliberate, as though shaped not just by water, but by intention. He imagined Laura standing here, sketchbook in hand, her words echoing, "The canyon doesn't want us to leave," for the first time. Elias felt he understood. This place was not passive, it was alive, not in the way trees breathe or rivers flow, but in the way a predator waits, silent and patient, shaping its lair for the moment prey wanders to deep. Hours passed in half-light, Elias pressing further into the curves and narrows. He came upon the site where his sister and Liam's remains had been discovered, marked now only by faint discolorations on the rock, a few faint etchings left behind by recovery crews. He crouched there, fingertips grazing the stone, heart pounding as though he were intruding on sacred ground. He searched for signs the reports had ignored, anything that might validate his suspicion. And then he saw them, faint scratches high on the canyon wall, deliberate, vertical, and ordered to be the work of falling debris. He studied them with a reverence bordering on fear. They looked like tally marks, for lines crossed by a fifth, repeated several times. Not random, not accidental. Marks left by human hands or something mimicking them. His chest tightened, breath shallow. He pulled his notebook from his pack and copied the marks, each line trembling beneath his pencil. The official story had never mentioned these. Dusk crept into the canyon before Elias realized how much time had passed. Shadows deepened until the walls seemed to close in. swallowing the last slivers of light. A sensible man would have turned back, but Elias felt himself rooted to the stone, as though leaving would sever a tether now wound too tightly around his chest. He sat cross-legged near the rockfall, the sound of dripping water punctuating the silence. Hours bled into one another. He imagined Laura beside him, knees tucked to her chest, telling him not to be afraid. He whispered aloud, voice breaking, asking her what had really happened. Only silence answered. Yet in that silence was a presence thick, watchful, pressing against his skin like unseen eyes. When Elias finally rose, it was not because he had found clarity, but because his body trembled with exhaustion. He left the canyon under moonlight, navigating by instinct rather than trail markers, emerging only at dawn with his clothes damp and his mind burning. He had not seen ghosts. He had not found undeniable evidence. But he had felt something vast, merciless, and intentional. He knew now why closure had eluded him. The canyon had not simply taken Laura and Liam. It had claimed them, as it had claimed others before, and it would claim again. From that night forward, Elias's purpose sharpened into obsession. He was no longer merely searching for answers. He was preparing for confrontation. Elias's life after that night became a ritual of preparation, a kind of private liturgy dedicated to the canyon. He began to record every detail in his notebook, weather shifts, ranger reports, even rumors overheard, from tourists who claimed to sense something strange in the subway. His small home in Springdale turned into a shrine of obsession. Maps covered the walls, their surfaces etched with circles and annotations. Photographs of Laura and Liam, once framed neatly in the living room, were now taped beside sketches of the canyon, blending memory and investigation until both seemed inseparable. The air smelled constantly of ink and dust, as though even the house had begun to surrender to the canyon's gravity. But obsession carried a cost. Elias's mother stopped visiting altogether, unable to bear the way he spoke of Laura in the present tense, as though she still lived just beyond the sandstone walls. His friends drifted further away, their patience worn thin by years of unanswered calls and canceled plans. Only the canyon remained faithful, pulling him deeper into its orbit. Nights were consumed by restless pacing, days by hikes into sections of Zion most tourists never touched. His body thinned, his skin weathered, until he resembled the very rock he studied, scarred, stubborn, enduring. Then came the letters, anonymous, scrawled in uneven handwriting. They began arriving in Elias's mailbox late one winter. The first contained nothing but a single phrase. "She didn't die the way they said." Another followed days later, bearing a crude sketch of a narrow canyon passage with an X marked on the wall. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, but Elias felt a chill of recognition. Whoever sent them knew things the official reports had omitted. Perhaps it was a cruel prank, yet the details gnawed at him. He traced the sketch against his own maps and found it matched a section of the subway near where the remains had been discovered. For the first time in years, Elias felt something beyond grief. He felt direction. He returned to the canyon that spring, carrying the letters folded neatly in his pocket. The trail was familiar now, the rhythm of descent etched into his muscles. Yet this time, he searched not for closure but for confirmation. He reached the marked section just as the sketch had indicated, a narrow choke point where the canyon walls, pressed so tightly together the sky was a sliver. At first, he saw nothing. Then, shifting his angle, he noticed faint symbols scratched high on the wall, similar to the tally marks he had seen months earlier, but arranged differently, circles intersecting with lines, crude yet deliberate. His pulse quickened. He scrambled closer, running his fingers over the etchings. They were shallow, but intentional, carved with something sharp. Not the random scarring of floodwaters, but a message, a code. The discovery ignited a new fire in him. Each night, Elias returned to his notebook, sketching and re-sketching the markings, comparing them to fragments he had collected from other parts of the canyon. He began to believe Laura and Liam had tried to leave messages in their final hours, warnings or attempts at communication that officials had overlooked or ignored. The thought electrified him. Perhaps their deaths were not accidents, but part of something larger, a pattern woven into the canyon's history. If so, then the subway was not just a place of tragedy, but of intent. A keeper of secrets, it revealed, only to those willing to sacrifice enough Yet with each revelation came a deeper unease. Elias started hearing footsteps behind him during his hikes, the sound of gravel shifting when no one was there. At night, faint knocks echoed through his walls, always 3 in a row, always just before dawn. He told himself it was exhaustion, the frayed edges of his mind inventing phantoms. But the boots by the door seemed to mock that reasoning. Some mornings he found them, turned slightly, pointing toward the canyon. He began to wonder if the canyon was not just alive, but reaching for him, tethering him to its hunger. By midsummer, Elias's obsession reached a breaking point. He confided in no one. There was no one left to confide in but he, resolved to spend an entire night inside the subway, alone, to see if the canyon would reveal what it had hidden. He packed lightly, rope, lamp, water, his notebook, and Laura's boots, which he carried in his pack like relics. The descent was slower than usual, not from hesitation, but from reverence. He whispered to the canyon as he walked, addressing it as one might address a god, half in plea, half in challenge. Darkness fell quickly within the canyon's twisting throat. The air grew colder, wetter, carrying the faint metallic tang of stone worn raw by floods. Elias settled near the rockfall where Laura and Liam had been found, arranging the boots before him like offerings. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the drip of unseen water. Then came the sound, faint at first, like fabric dragging against stone, then clearer, footsteps moving where no one should be. Elias froze, every muscle taut. His lamp flickered, shadows jittering across the canyon walls. He called out quietly at first, then louder, Laura's name spilling from his throat like a prayer. The footsteps paused. Then, unmistakably, a whisper, "Elias." The voice was thin, stretched by distance, yet it carried his sister's cadence. His chest constricted, tears burning his eyes. He staggered to his feet, lamp trembling in his grip, scanning the canyon. But the walls reflected only his own breath, clouds of vapor curling in the cold air. Again the whisper came, this time from behind, closer, insistent. He spun, but there was only darkness. Hours bled together in a fever of fear and longing. He scribbled frantically in his notebook, recording every sound, every shift of shadow, until his handwriting collapsed into jagged lines. When dawn finally arrived, it did not bring relief, but a hollow exhaustion. Elias left the canyon with shaking hands, the boots still damp with dew, the whisper still echoing in his ears. He did not know whether he had touched the supernatural or merely shattered the last fragile barrier of his mind. But one truth remained unshaken. Laura was not gone, not completely. The canyon still held her, and now it had begun to hold him too. In the weeks that followed, Elias no longer spoke of closure. He no longer sought explanations in geology or weather patterns. Instead, he surrendered to the idea that the subway was not simply a canyon, but a threshold, a place where the boundary between the living and the lost was thin, enough to rupture. He had crossed it once, and he knew he would cross it again. His notebook swelled with sketches, theories, fragments of overheard whispers. His house became a mausoleum of paper and stone, a place where even the air seemed heavy with dust and dread. Yet through it all, Elias felt a strange calm. For the first time since Laura disappeared, he no longer feared forgetting her. He no longer feared the silence of her absence, because he understood, now, that the canyon had written them both into its story, binding them in stone and shadow. And one day, when his body failed and his steps faltered, he too would vanish into the sandstone, another ghost etched into the subway's endless memory. The dust of Zion still tasted like memory, but now, it tasted like fate.